Press record. And I'm LZ, Director of Education. Welcome to our last virtual Teachback in this series, which has been absolutely incredible. We are doing this as a result of an amazing gathering of educators that we did here at Eastern State last summer as our inaugural Teacher Institute, where we explored with 6 teachers and many teacher advisors the ways in which we can bring the topic of incarceration and mass incarceration into our classrooms. And so we've been bringing in experts all spring, experts in classroom work, experts in topics in incarceration, to teach us things that they know. And so you're going to hear about things that our Teacher Institute teachers did. And we'll be joined today by my colleague Ryan on the education team, by Miriam Rock, who's one of our teacher advisors for the Teacher Institute, and Jennifer Turner, who is an expert joining us from the ACLU. We'll start with Jennifer's talk. We'll go into an activity that we did in the Teacher Institute led by Ryan, and then Miriam will talk about how she's brought these topics into her classroom in a high school here in Philly. These Teachbacks have been super informal. We encourage you to, ask questions, come off mute if you're comfortable, drop things in the chat. But with that, I think we're going to kick it off to Jennifer, and I'm going to make everybody who's speaking a co-host so you can easily share any slide decks. So let me do that.
Thanks. I'm going to try to share. Can you see okay? Oops. Do you guys see? Yeah. Good. Okay. So thanks so much for having me. I'm really delighted to talk with you all about the subject of prison labor in the US. I researched this subject for a couple of years at the ACLU, like a multi-year investigation that led to a report that we issued almost 2 years ago called Captive Labor. And we've been doing advocacy work on this ever since. And I'll talk a little bit about the advocacy work to change these policies. But at first, I'm going to talk about what we found looking into this subject. This is the cover of the report. It's aclu.org/captive labor. You can find it there. But I'll talk about the investigation into this, and to the origin of this came from, I was researching the topic of life without parole sentences for people convicted of nonviolent crimes. I went to Angola Prison, Louisiana State Penitentiary in Louisiana. And when I was there, saw incarcerated workers doing a variety of different types of work. The warden was really proud of their work. But one thing that really struck me was this is a prison where the vast majority of incarcerated people are Black men. And we passed the fields in Angola where every man is required to work for 2 cents an hour, sometimes for no pay at all. And these workers were almost all Black men overseen by a white corrections officer on horseback, holding a shotgun on the site of a former slave plantation. I thought this is horrifying. And there were other things about the prison labor program that seemed like other vestiges of slavery as well, including that the prison will send a worker to staff the governor's mansion, like as a butler and like support staff. And so it was in my mind to research this. And the other thing I was interested in is this is a huge category of workers in the US as a workers' rights issue too. And so, but there's almost no data or investigation into the subject. We don't really know how many people are working in prisons. We didn't know exactly what they're paid, what kind of work they're doing. We had a sense, but really tried to do a big investigation. And I'll talk about the history first, to the extent you're interested. And so the origins of prison labor programs in the US are foundation is chattel slavery in America. And the origins of these labor programs really is in the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery in 1865, but included a gaping loophole, except for those punished for a crime. And this really allowed prisons to fulfill the need for unpaid labor by using incarcerated people. And the prison labor program, the early prison labor program, some of the vestiges of that we see in today's labor program. So initially after abolition, convict leasing became rampant throughout the South and extended throughout the country. In the North, really, there were programs that were largely like contract programs where people were contracted to work in factories for as much as 17 hours a day, building factories and laying railroads. mining coal. And in the South, people were engaged in convict leasing where they were leased to private companies or individuals for months, days, months, or even years under the complete control of the leaser, doing work from plantations, coal mines, phosphate pits, turpentine farms, and really brutal work. So brutal that in Mississippi, not a single person who worked as a leased convict even survived their 10-year sentence. People were subject to beatings and terrible punishments. And it truly was slavery by another name. Today, we've I'll talk about the modern forms of convict leasing that are a little bit different, but still involve this idea of people being contracted out to private parties or companies to work. Another aspect of this was incredibly lucrative. This generated millions of dollars in today's money for departments of corrections and states, and it really led to the effective re-enslavement of Black people by the passage of Black codes, which allowed people to be arrested, mostly Black men, on totally special charges for doing nothing, and it allowed them to be incarcerated and then forced to work. Free labor objected to the competition from incarcerated labor, and this led to the downfall of the convict leasing system, not because it was so brutal, but more because it prevented it was a form of lower paid work or unpaid work. And so what transitioned to was chain gangs, and this proliferated throughout the country. Every state except Rhode Island had these programs, though they were more common in the South, where people are literally chained together day and night and forced to work on the roads and do public works projects. And this led to a state youth system where the state became the only lawful purchaser of goods and labor. And eventually chain gangs fell out of favor as well because they were so horrible. You can see a picture here. Although we today still use incarcerated workers to work on public works projects, to work on roads, dig ditches, and they're usually not changed, though occasionally are. So again, we see these vestiges of these early, incredibly abusive work programs in today's work programs. And this transition from slavery to prison labor, prison labor existed before the 13th Amendment, before the abolition, but really proliferated and then expanded even more as prison systems grew. But what we've seen too is penal plantations, that in some cases there was a seamless transition from slave plantation to prison. And today, at least states Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, North Carolina, and Texas have penal plantations that are located on the site of former slave plantations. And in some places like Texas, over a less than 20-year period after abolition, the state of Texas purchased 10 plantations and began running them as prisons. Some of those still operate today. And today we see incarcerated workers producing some of the same crops on the same land that were tilled by enslaved people less than 160 years ago. There's just a very direct link to this history. And one incarcerated worker at Angola prison said that one deputy correctional officer told him, well, people escaped slavery before. That's not going to happen now because this is legal. And these are workers in North Carolina, also on the site of a former slave plantation, harvesting crops. Now today, so our research was looking at, so what's happening today? We found that 65% of people in prisons work. That's nearly 800,000 incarcerated workers. We didn't get data on jails and immigration detention facilities and juvenile correctional facilities because it's so hard to get data. And work these people are doing in many ways is the same as people on the outside, but there are some crucial distinctions. They're under the complete control of their employers. Their employer is their jailer. They're forced to work. They have no right to refuse to work or to choose the type of work that they do. And the reason they have no right to refuse to work is because of the 13th Amendment exception clause. 16 states still have constitutional provisions also mirroring the 13th Amendment. And they're stripped of even the most minimal protections against labor exploitation and abuse. All of our major laws governing workers explicitly exclude incarcerated workers either in the text of the law or through court interpretation. So our minimum wage law, our federal minimum wage law, actually doesn't exclude incarcerated workers, but courts have interpreted the law to exclude them. Workplace work and safety laws exclude incarcerated workers. Protections against discrimination on the workplace don't apply. The right to bargain, to unionize doesn't apply either. Here's sort of the key findings from our research. That's the like table of contents from the report. If you're interested, it's really long. There's lots of data about and information about everything. But the key things I'll talk about is how people are forced to work, the wages that they're paid, some data on the types of work they do. The big question, who benefits from prison labor? We documented really dangerous working conditions and terrible preventable injuries, and the real lack of vocational training or skills development, because so much of this work is maintenance work that doesn't really confer skills that help people get employment after. So first, forced labor, I mentioned this, the 13th Amendment allows forced labor for people convicted of a crime. And the federal prison system in many states actually have formal compulsory labor requirements. So if you're incarcerated, you have to work if you're in a federal prison and many state prisons. And more than 76% of incarcerated workers say that they're required to work. And they say that if they're injured, disabled, have a disability, they're too old or infirm to work, they still have to work. And the punishments levied against people if they are not able to or unwilling to do the work assigned to them, or don't perform their job in a satisfactory way, are really, really terrible. People can be subject to placed in solitary confinement for many months at a time. I've talked to people who spent years in solitary confinement. One worker I interviewed who had been incarcerated in Arkansas on the site of a former slave plantation, was a Black man. He was assigned the job of picking cotton. He said he was willing to do any other job, but that was anathema to him because his ancestors picked cotton on that land, and it was just a job he was simply, for great reasons, unwilling to do, and was placed in solitary for years and years, every cotton season, 4 months at a time. So people are subject to placed in solitary confinement. They lose the opportunity to earn good time credits, which is a way to reduce your sentence. So it means it effectively extends the amount of time you'd serve in prison. You can get reprimands that will affect your parole eligibility. This is a really powerful inducement and force people to work, is that being taken away from your family even longer. And people can lose access to phone calls home, family visitation, access to commissary where they buy the things that they absolutely need, like warm clothing, sufficient food, medicine. And the other thing we found was wages. We found that 7 states pay nothing at all for prison, or for nearly all workers. These are unsurprisingly all southern states. And we found that the average wage paid to people was 13 to 52 cents per hour. The vast majority of workers at the low end of the spectrum, because they're engaged in maintenance work. So there are a few like higher paying jobs, but those typically are not very numerous. We also found wages are stagnant for decades. People in many cases states haven't provided a wage increase, a raise in decades. So workers have been working 5 cents an hour for 30 or 20 years. But even those low wages aren't theirs to keep. These wages are garnished. So workers will see as much as 80% just taken away before they even get their paycheck. And these are deducted to cover court-imposed fines or restitution, and even room and board, which is truly appalling, to charge people room and board. And actually many states, that's a majority of the wage deductions are for room and board or cost of confinement fees. And this has a real impact. Here's a picture of some women working in a laundry facility. And I'll talk about the safety issues, but just look at the scale of this. It's not like your laundry at home. These are 400-pound laundry carts. It's really dangerous industrial work that people are engaged in every prison in the country. But what it means is that because wages are so low, family members have to go into debt to support their loved ones. And people, when they're incarcerated, it costs a lot to stay in touch with family members. They have these debts that I mentioned, court-ordered fines and fees they have to pay back. And commissary, people to have sufficient clothing, food, medicine, hygiene products, shampoo, tampons, they all have to buy this at hyperinflationary costs from the prison commissary. And because wages are so low and people are incarcerated, they're not self-sufficient. They're not able to pay for it themselves. And so loved ones have to step in. And families with an incarcerated loved one pay an estimated $2.9 billion just on some phone calls. And over half of these families are forced to go into debt, which is a real cost of not paying incarcerated workers. We surveyed incarcerated workers, and what we did and the Bureau of Justice Statistics did, and found that 70% of incarcerated workers that we surveyed said they were not able to afford basic necessities with their prison wages. 64% are concerned about their safety while working. 70% said they received no job training of any kind. And 76%, as I mentioned before, are forced to work or face punishment. What kind of work are people doing? Now, we found that the vast majority of people in prisons are working maintenance jobs. So these are jobs to maintain the prisons that confine them. This is 30% are doing janitorial work, 20% are working in the kitchen and food preparation duties, then other essential services, including grounds maintenance. Now, about 8% of incarcerated workers are doing public works assignments. I'll talk about that in a little bit. We're being contracted out to state and local agencies to do public works projects. 6.5% are doing prison industries work for state-owned. These are publicly owned prison industries operating. Every state except Alaska has these programs. About 2% are doing agriculture, 2% in work release, and less than 0.5% are directly employed by private companies through a program that pays these workers prevailing wages. It's a very small percentage of incarcerated workers who are working for private companies directly through these programs. But who benefits from this? At the same time that we're paying workers pennies per hour or nothing at all, they're generating a tremendous amount of revenue through their work and through the goods and services that they provide. And just the 6.5% who are doing state industries work are generating over $2 billion in goods, services, and commodities through that program. The value of maintenance work of the over 80% of workers who are maintaining the prisons that confine them is really hard to estimate. One economist conservatively estimated it at $9 billion. I think it's far more than that probably, but and this is really keeps us from really contending with the real cost of mass incarceration, because we run our prisons on the backs of unpaid and low paid work. And in fact, the vast majority of our state corrections budgets goes to salaries for corrections officers, but we don't consider the cost of the people incarcerated who are working, the value of that labor, which really keeps us from really contending with the costs of our skyrocketing, the cost of our bloated prison system. Here's governments spend over $5 billion a year just on corrections, and less than 1% of those budgets go to corrections, to the salaries for incarcerated workers, while 68% go to the publicly paid corrections officers for wages and benefits. And that's, you can see, I've got pictures of workers. So this is a road crew who also benefits the public, state, local, and federal governments. So not only does the prison system benefit because of the maintenance work, but state and local governments rely on low paid and unpaid workers for a variety of public works projects. These are workers doing work clearing weeds, and workers through these programs will work offsite outside of prisons, doing all kinds of work, maintaining cemeteries and school grounds, fairgrounds, public parks. They'll do road work. They contract with the Department of Transportation in many states to do road work, clearing roads, digging ditches. They build buildings, clean government offices, clean up landfills and hazardous spills. There's a lot of toxic and dangerous work involved. Treating sewage, culling birds infected with avian flu. If a government office finds they have an asbestos problem, they can contract with the Department of Corrections to have incarcerated workers remove asbestos, to do asbestos abatement work. And the value of this work is also incredibly high. The Department of Corrections in Florida uses unpaid incarcerated workers doing state road crews, and that generates millions of dollars. Department of Corrections in New York has drawn in millions of dollars selling labor contracts for abatement services. State governments also rely on incarcerated workers to respond to disasters and emergencies. At least 30 states actually include explicitly incarcerated workers in their statewide emergency response plans. And we found that at least 14 states have incarcerated workers battling wildfires. And workers will also be involved in preparing for hurricanes. So we've seen cases in Texas where an area will have been evacuated and people in prison are stuck there bagging sandbags and preparing for the hurricane, helping with evacuation. They deal with the cleanup afterwards. In Georgia, nearly a third of the counties in the state rely on incarcerated workers who are firefighters, not only to deal with wildfires, but also respond to house fires and auto wrecks as well. And they're the sole emergency medical responders. And state prison industries, I mentioned this is about 6.5% of incarcerated workers. These are industries that are state-owned corporations, and every state except Alaska has these, and they produce goods and services and commodities that are sold by the prison industries program. And each states are slightly different, but these programs, they pay just a little bit more than non-industry jobs per hour. And most states and the federal government, these prison industries programs are preferred contract, like they're preferred vendors. So if say a governor needs, a new governor comes in and needs new letterhead, they'll buy it from the state industries program. They actually have to go to them first. If you need tables and chairs in a public college, they go to the state correctional industries program to buy that furniture. Most states, about 38 states, all of their license plates are manufactured by incarcerated workers. But people are doing far more than just that. They are repairing vehicles, police vehicles, making bulletproof vests for cops, for police officers. They're washing laundry for public hospitals and public institutions. They're making glasses or lenses for public institutions and hospitals and secure facilities. They also do services like answering DMV call center. And increasingly, these programs are, in some states at least, are contracting with private companies to have their workers in these programs work for private companies. And what the state industries are doing is they sell labor contracts to private companies to employ incarcerated workers, and the workers get a fraction of the amount. So the Department of Corrections difference pay $7 an hour, the workers are paid $3 an hour, the Department of Corrections keeps the money, keeps what's left behind, keeps the difference. And this is increasingly happening. Arizona really pioneered this. We've been seeing it in other states as well. And through these programs, incarcerated workers are involved in food production. They're working on egg processing plants. And through this are a lot of the products that they produce are ending up in consumers, in supermarkets or in our homes without us knowing that they originate in incarcerated prison labor. These are just some of the money generated. These programs, as I mentioned, generate over $2 billion. And you can see here the states that have some of the highest amounts of money generated through the programs. The private sector benefits too, but this is really a small percentage of who's benefiting from prison labor. Most of this work is really benefiting us as the public. It's benefiting prison systems. It's benefiting state and local governments. But as I mentioned, private companies do employ incarcerated workers directly as well. Where private companies are really truly profiting the most, though, is through incarcerated people's need to provide for their basic needs in prison, like health and food and communications. So these private companies contract to provide the food. They contract to provide run commissary. They run telephone communications, and they reap tremendous profits. That's really where private companies are profiting the most over incarceration. Something else I mentioned before is that the incarcerated workers are excluded from even the most standard workplace protections that apply to anyone else outside of prisons. And that includes the laws that provide for minimum wage and overtime pay, protection from discrimination, the right to unionize, as well as health and safety laws. So the federal statutes and most state statutes that provide for health and safety protections for workers don't apply to incarcerated workers. And this is a huge problem because workers are really working in dangerous conditions. Incarcerated workers are like a uniquely vulnerable workforce because they're forced to work. They face these severe punishments if they won't work. They don't get to choose the work. And what we also found was that because there's no regulation, there's no oversight, you don't have the Department of Labor or OSHA coming to look at work conditions, and the prisons are not required to report anything about who's getting hurt and what kind of injuries happen. And the work that incarcerated workers are doing is can be really dangerous. They're employed in meat and poultry and egg processing plants, which are really dangerous for anyone, but especially for incarcerated people who have no rights. They are doing garment manufacturing work, but as I mentioned before, like this is food preparation. I can show a picture that like it's not working in your own kitchen. These are industrial scale kitchens, industrial scale laundries. They're doing work with deli slicers, sawmills, forestry work. And what we found was that people suffer horrific injuries, many of which are preventable. And I could tell you a lot of terrible stories. I think one kind of helpful one. I think the other thing that's really distinct is people aren't getting training. And that's something that 64% of workers we surveyed said they received no training, or so we said they were concerned about their safety. 70% said they got no training. And what's different for incarcerated workers is that you can be given a task to work, given a chainsaw. You've never seen a chainsaw in your life. No one's training you how to do it. There's no protocol how to use it. And you got to use it. It's not like somebody who's like an expert in their field and has like the Teachback suit and the protective gear that they use every day. These products are, PPE is not provided to these workers either. And what we documented was really serious injuries of people burned with chemicals, maimed or killed on the job, people, losing limbs. And as I said, it's very hard to get data, but over a 4-year period, the California Prison Industries Program, which employs just about 6% of incarcerated workers in the state, had more than 600 injuries over that 4-year period. And that included like repeated eye injuries because people were working without goggles. Like it's very easy to fix these issues, but people and incarcerated workers we interviewed reported like, I asked for when they were tasked to like wade into sewage to deal with a pipe. We're told you're shit out of luck. You can't have any protection. And that is really unacceptable. And we've documented numerous cases where there just wasn't protective equipment, machine guarding mechanisms, training, et cetera. And then we also found people are denied medical care when they're injured on the job. So one woman who was nearly decapitated in a sawmill was given a menstrual pad because they had nothing else to help, and not even sent to the hospital. People with chemical burns being given diaper ointment. One case, a man who slipped and fell in the prison kitchen, had an injury and received such substandard care. He got a horrible infection and had to have his leg amputated. So the medical care after the fact of injury is also really, really terrible. I mentioned the failure to train, but like people aren't trained how to handle these hazardous chemicals. There isn't somebody, trained operator. And again, this is because of the lack of legal protections that we outside of the prison context, these are heavily regulated work often, especially these types of dangerous type work that people are doing. The other thing is people who are incarcerated are often tasked to handle toxic chemicals in the course of their work, or biohazardous materials like blood or excrement. And again, there aren't protections there. And during COVID-19 is like really instructive example of what happened to incarcerated workers, but nearly every state in the country used incarcerated workers in its pandemic response. And I mentioned these state prison industries programs. These are factories in US prisons. And during the very early days of COVID, at least 40 states, their prison industries programs pivoted to production of personal protective equipment and hand sanitizer. So these are the days where everyone was sheltering in place, and incarcerated people who are at the highest risk of COVID were working incredibly long shifts without the benefit of the masks that they were making, without benefit of access to the hand sanitizer they were making. And it also incarcerated people were tasked with working in mobile morgue units, transporting dead bodies, digging mass graves, building coffins. And some of them were also exposed at the very front line of the medical health response, washing hospital laundry, disinfecting hospital supplies, cleaning medical units. It just really high risk work. And even though these workers were required to work in these early days, and also workers doing other types of work that was classified as essential labor, were often left out of the first vaccine rollout. And the other thing we found, sorry if I'm going on too long, I don't have the time, but okay, let me know, just cut me off. The other thing we found is that despite that the incarcerated work, a lot of it's just dead-end jobs that aren't going to help them to get employment after prison. So despite many incarcerated people ranking skills learning as one of their most important reasons to work, we found that a lot of these jobs don't involve skills learning of any kind. Over 80% are maintenance work. Here you can see pictures of incarcerated people picking up horse feces during a parade. But people can be tasked with cleaning toilets, janitorial work that farm, agricultural work, garment industry work that is not going to help them get a job. And in fact, oversight analysis of prison industry's jobs in Mississippi and Texas found like, look, there are no job prospects for farm work and garment manufacturing. Why is this the work that we're giving incarcerated people? We should be teaching them, giving them skills that will actually translate to employment. But that too often is just not the case. And when even some of the vocational training programs and formerly incarcerated and currently incarcerated people describe some of it as like stuff from the dinosaur era. They weren't learning like current computer technology either. And beyond that, incarcerated people are often shut out from work after they're released from prison because of licensing restrictions. So someone may have worked while incarcerated as a hospice caretaker, caring for dying and severely ill incarcerated people. May do that work for years while incarcerated, but will not be able to work as a home health care aide or as a hospice nurse because of state licensing restrictions that restrict people with criminal convictions from doing that work, even if their criminal conviction has nothing to do with the area of work. It's not like they built an elderly person who was dying before they went to prison, and that's why it's usually totally unrelated. And so these restrictions are hugely problematic too. So what are our recommendations to change things? First, ending forced labor. And repealing slavery exclusion clauses. Slavery has no place in the United States today in 2024, both at the state levels, in the states that don't currently prohibit slavery and forced labor without exception, as well as our federal constitution, which still has that 13th Amendment language, but also ending these punishments. Work can't be truly voluntary. You can be placed in solitary confinement because you didn't pick cotton fast enough, or because you didn't want to report to the prison when you had COVID, a prison kitchen job when you had COVID, which is another example in Colorado, for instance. Guarantee workers standard labor protections. Treat them the same as people outside of prisons. Give them the same protections. Pay them minimum wage. Give them the same health and safety protections. Allow them to unionize and collectively bargain so that they can decide for themselves what employment rights they want and be able to assert their own rights at work. And on the pay issue, recent research has shown that even though paying incarcerated workers the minimum wage or prevailing wage would initially cost a lot, over the long term, there's actually real fiscal arguments in favor of doing this because it will allow incarcerated people to be self-sufficient. Their families won't go into debt. It will generate tax revenue because you can actually tax people's work. They will be able to pay back some of these debts that they usually leave prison saddled with. And studies show that recidivism is reduced when people have some savings and stable employment when they return home to their communities. And so it also will allow payment back with victim restitution. And so there are like real fiscal benefits as well of paying incarcerated workers, but there are true benefits for both the incarcerated people, their loved ones, and for victims of crime. Minimum wage, I mentioned, limit wage deductions, only to, ending room and board deductions, and allow people to earn into Social Security and Medicare. Right now, because incarcerated workers' wages are so low, and because some of our tax laws explicitly exclude work performed while in prison, someone could be incarcerated for 40 years, work all of those 40 years, but none of that time working counts as employment for Social Security. And it makes it really hard for people to be able to support themselves and their families after they return home to their communities. And then safety laws to protect workers and, requiring training as well. And expanding vocational training programs. These programs are declining, and we're finding that maintenance work is actually a larger percentage of work every year. And these vocational programs are declining, even though some studies show that they actually pay for themselves and reduce recidivism rates, if you believe the recidivism data. And I'll just say briefly, in terms of things are sort of starting to move on this. Advocates incarcerated and formerly incarcerated advocates have been for years advocating for reforms, and there have been some major prison strikes. There's one in Alabama right now, but there have been two major prior prison strikes. There were work stoppages where incarcerated people had a variety of demands, including related to prison labor and ending forced labor. And formerly incarcerated advocates in states around the country have been working for years for reforms. And now in the last few years, 7 states have amended their state constitutions to end their state constitutional exception clauses. And there's a pending federal bill and efforts in other states to bring a vote to ballot initiative for voters to vote in favor of amending their state constitution. But what's been interesting is in these states that have passed these ballot initiatives, it's been bipartisan support, people coming across party aisles to say, like, voters saying, wait, there's no place for slavery today. Why do we have this antiquated language? Senator Booker and on the House side, I'm forgetting the Representative Cleaver introduced identical legislation, but Senator Booker worked to draft 4 bills that would strengthen the protections for incarcerated workers, including addressing all of these exclusions, having workplace safety, minimum wage protections, discrimination protections for incarcerated workers. And there's pending legislation in some states, including in New York, that may be passed by the state legislature that would set a $3 minimum wage and end forced labor and punishments for refusal or inability to work. And here's a link to the report. We have an online action to Congress to pass the Abolition Amendment, which would amend the 13th Amendment, which gets reintroduced every Juneteenth, but right now it's pending. And I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. There is real interest in your slide deck. If you're willing to share it, we can also send it out to all of the teachers that have participated.
Yeah, I'm absolutely happy to email it. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, that's awesome. And then Kim asked a question about, are there any cases in the judicial system working their way up to the Supreme Court that you can talk about?
Great question. So they're not working their way up to the Supreme Court, yes, but there are a bunch of cases. I've been doing amicus briefs, like friend of the court briefs, in a couple of cases brought by unpaid or low paid workers who are saying that the state minimum wage laws should apply. One of those cases in California was thrown out by the appellate court, but in the Fourth Circuit just ruled in our favor in a case that's going back down to the lower court. And this was brought by workers in Baltimore who are employed they're in Baltimore jails and employed at an offsite recycling facility run by Baltimore County, and in really bad working conditions and being paid very little, working alongside non-incarcerated workers. And the lower court had said, oh no, the minimum wage doesn't apply to these workers. But the Fourth Circuit said, actually, it might. We think it well could, and didn't say officially that it applies to these workers, but said the lower court used the wrong standard and needs to look at it. And that could make its way up to the Supreme Court because there's a split. There's another circuit that ruled the other way. So it's possible it could go up to the Supreme Court. I think there's a question of do we want it to right now, given the composition of the court, but that is promising. But what I think really interesting is there are 3 major lawsuits pending. So one of the strategies of advocates who've been pushing for state constitutional amendments to to ban forced labor and slavery for everybody is that it could lead to litigation in courts to give more meaning to this quote unquote new constitutional right that slavery is illegal. But basically, after Colorado passed their constitutional amendment, incarcerated people were subject to forced work requirement, and people in Colorado say that conditions didn't change. So COVID hit and people were forced to work, who were fearful of contracting COVID, who did have COVID, and there was told, no, if you don't show up to work, you're gonna get downgraded to a much more more secure, more horrible unit, terrible cell. You're gonna lose your contact with families, and you'll be placed in solitary. So incarcerated people brought a class action lawsuit in Colorado that's pending, saying that no, actually, when we say no forced labor, we mean it, and you're in violation. And they're saying that the provisions that no forced labor also means we need to pay minimum wage. So it should be interesting whether the court will confer other rights at work to workers is another question. And in Alabama, there are now 2 lawsuits. Alabama in the last election in November, that vote again, amended the state constitution. And there are 2 lawsuits now brought by incarcerated people. They're a little bit different, but really strong lawsuits as well. Well, again, saying that workers are being forced to work in violation of their state constitution. And there's an interesting case in Louisiana too, saying that even though Louisiana did not bring it to a vote, the legislature did not pass a bill that would bring an amendment to a potential amendment to their state constitution to voters. The incarcerated people have sued, saying that actually the current work programs violate the violate the 13th Amendment of the Constitution, because you have to have been duly convicted of a crime in order to be allowed to be subjected to indentured servitude and forced labor. And in Louisiana, there's no requirement for unanimous juries. And they're saying that's actually not, people aren't duly convicted if you don't have a full jury that has convicted you. Louisiana is going to be unique in that. So anyway, there's some interesting cases coming up. And I think we'll see more. And I think the strategy in a lot of these states is if we can get new constitutional provisions, that maybe we can then have some state court litigation. I think for a lot of lawyers doing civil rights litigation, they're increasingly interested in state courts, because our Supreme Court is not a place to go to vindicate your constitutional rights right now. And a lot of the federal courts are still packed with Trump appointees and not friendly, especially in some of the states with the most egregious civil rights issues. So we're increasingly interested in pursuing state courts, state court litigation, at least in the shorter term.
Thanks, Jennifer. And Ryan has a question in the chat. And Kim says that maybe there was a case, Ramos versus Louisiana, right? Oh yeah. I feel like we talked about this.
Yes.
Yeah. Ryan wants to know about any wrongful death suits related to work practices inside of prisons.
Yeah, that's a great question, Ryan. So this is interesting. There are a few wrongful death suits. So for the research for this report, I looked at any case that made it into federal courts about major injuries or deaths in work. And there are some. It's very difficult when first of all, you aren't entitled to workers' compensation when you're incarcerated, but you also, because of the Prison Litigation Reform Act, made it extremely difficult to file cases in federal courts in courts to vindicate your rights when they've been violated when you've been incarcerated for a whole range of issues. And it really has made it very hard for no matter what kind of conditions issue and horrific things happen to you in prison, it makes it very hard for your case to go forward. And that's really limited the chances for people especially who are injured on the job, to have their case heard in the courts. But there have been some wrongful death suits filed. And I know of efforts to track deaths in prison while working, but there's no outside authority doing it. The Department of Labor isn't doing it. And we're asking them to do that, because we're actually working on advocacy directed at the Department of Labor right now, saying you don't have to wait for Congress to act. You actually can say that incarcerated workers are covered by minimum wage laws. You can go visit prisons and look at prison working conditions. You don't need, you can do the right thing without waiting for something to happen. Oh, thanks for that case.
Yeah, I kind of remember that too. I think, are there any, I think we can take one more question for Jennifer. Jennifer has to hop off in about 10 minutes. So any other questions for Jennifer?
Oh, and heat exhaustion, Brian mentioned. Heat exhaustion is a really big issue. I mean, in prisons overall, but it's something we documented in the work context, because field labor, obviously extremely hot work, and talking to incarcerated workers in Louisiana and Mississippi described seeing people passing out while working in the fields. But beyond that, I mean, I documented even deaths from heat exposure for people who are working as firefighters, who are even in training exercises. in Nevada and California. I documented death of an incarcerated worker in Texas who was wearing a hot suit to train attack dogs to chase after escaped incarcerated people, and he died because of the heat exposure. But I think for each of these cases, there are many others that don't necessarily get covered in the press or through courts. Yeah, and there's a lot of effort on the heat exposure issue. There's a lot of litigation in Texas and Louisiana. And I'm not as much of an expert outside of the work context, but this is a huge issue just for people who are incarcerated outside of work. I mean, it's just it's really bad.
And I just popped a couple articles into the chat related to that issue. And I remember Arizona also has really struggled, which is shocking because a lot of their Texas and Arizona is always shocking to me because they're in such hot locations, yet a lot of their facilities don't have air conditioning.
No, and I think it's a choice. I mean, I remember at Angola, the warden was like proud of the fact that the people on death row have no air conditioning. Like it's a deliberate choice to have them in the most extreme, horrible conditions. That's something you keep talking about with this is like we sentence people to a period of confinement. We don't sentence them to torture. We don't sentence them to being mutilated, at work or like, I mean, it's so barbaric, honestly.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of work to be done, but I think everyone on this call believes knowledge is power, right?
Yeah,
you can't unknow what you know. So it's really important. And I think I have a feeling that some folks want to share their slide decks with your slide deck with their students. And we also dropped the link to the report in the chat, which rocked my world the first time that I saw it. And then Ryan and I started teaching with it. So highly recommend that to everybody on the call. So I think with that, we really want to thank you, Jennifer. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
I'll share the slide deck, and it's my slide deck, and then the last slides are just the infographics and photos, so you can just copy and paste them if you just want like a few pages. So like take whatever you want. I love that. Please do.
Yeah, I mean the infographics in the report are just, I mean, that's what we did. We were just like, I'll go in the presentation that we made. So thank you for that. And thank you to your team for creating something so dynamic and useful.
Thanks so much.
Yeah. And so I think with that, we will turn it over to you, Ryan.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Jennifer, for the presentation. It's always amazing and very, very insightful and educational each time. Give me 1 second here. So with that, I am going to run through this pretty quickly so we can give my friend and a great teacher, Miriam, time to tell us all what she does in her class. Hopefully she could teach me something more. I learn from her each and every day. Well, each and every time she speaks here at Eastern State, or even when we went to her classrooms and seen what she did in the classroom. She's familiar with this activity. For everybody else, it's not. This is something called defining justice. Now, this is something I actually have to implement in a tour tomorrow, in which the purpose of this is to really get people thinking and providing thought-provoking questions and perspectives as far as what does justice mean to them, and really let's take a look at it and try to redefine it in more contemporary means. So if you want to participate, feel more than welcome to. You could either come off a mute or you could put it in the chat as answer the question, what is justice? When you see a photo like this, everybody has their own unique perspective. Something I learned is unconscious biasness, in which we believe we know what we know, but there's always more to know, right? So in this, some things to take away from it, we could see that justice here is blind. We could see that off to the left-hand side, there is an arm that's pointed out very, very straight, very strong, if you will, with a sword in it. And over to our right over here, we have the raising of the balancing of scales. Now, let's see right here. Okay. What we know as educators, as teachers, as lawyers for the ACLU with these reports and contributing members that's in this chat right now, justice isn't always just. And if it was balanced like this, I think our world today would be a lot different. However, it's not my intention to sway opinion, sway perspective, or to provide that perspective or the answers to this, because if we had the answers to this, our society would be a lot better. This program, in which we would take a picture of Lady Justice here, or maybe multiple versions of this, present it to the classroom, present it to a tour, present it to an audience by saying, in your own perspective, what is justice? Can you define it for us? We would then go over some historical data as far as prison labor workshop, kind of touch on the pinpoints of forced labor when it comes to prisons. Where do these crimes come from? What is the best methods to really try to correct incorrect behavior? Is it prison? Is it reform? Is it rehabilitation? Is there a better way to do this outside of prison? And then on the back end of it, bring this photo back in and say, okay, now what can we redefine justice as? What do we want to look at it or see it as going forward? Does it still want to be presented as the statue that we see in front of us? Or can we come up with a new image, a new idea, or a new real perspective of how we can make things better? And what does that look like implemented? So that is, again, a lot of content, a small amount of time. I want to give Miriam sufficient time to give her presentation. But if there's any questions of this, or any questions or any comments that you want to share with us, feel free to pop them in the chat. Or that was my answer to Ryan's question. Let me iterate these
You
slides.
said, what do you see? I said aggressive.
Okay.
That was like the first thing I thought of today.
Yeah, it's the work we do with this, I mean, the work that Jennifer's doing is amazing. Bringing awareness to these issues, we don't know what we don't know, right? So in the general public, we look at it, we think everybody gets a fair trial, we think everybody gets a fair chance at life, right? Something I take away from this with these balance scales, right? That's kind of suggesting that society is in a balance and we're all starting from the same starting points, but that's not necessarily true at all. Some people are growing up in cities, some people are growing up in the suburbs, some people grow up with two parents, some of us grow up with one. I grew up with my grandmother. We don't all have the same starting points, and mistakes look different to everybody as they go forward. Uncommon things become more common, more frequent when we see them. So we become desensitized to news because we see bad news every day. It's not necessarily a normal variable that we're supposed to have or adjust to going into society. But I say all this to say, if people are able to learn and to be taught and to really be willing to accept this information going forward, society could be a lot better places. This photo, to me, this doesn't represent justice. I don't want justice to be blind. I want them to understand and be conscious of the variables leading up to the situation. You know, I was told ignorance of the law is no excuse. How can you see something that's invisible? If you're not made aware of something, how then can you be held responsible to be aware of it, right? When it comes to this sword, it's a very strong symbol. Like, is it only through crime and punishment? Is this sword only representing punishment? Where is the help? Where's the support? Where is the guidance? Where's the teaching? Where's the reform? And then again, when it comes to these scales, I just can't really accept that everything's in a balance like this, because through my personal bias, the lived experience, through my experience going through life as it is, I think through everybody's experience, you know, life's not always fair. Things are only in the balance of this. Sometimes everything's good, sometimes everything's bad, sometimes it's in between. So I don't know what the justice, or I don't know what the image I would use as far as like defining justice going forward would look like. Maybe more just like a picture of the world with arms embracing it with some help. But this is a program you can implement with your classrooms, with students, with anybody you could share with, and really just provide thought-provoking questions. As far as this goes, I'm more involved in it because it's through a Zoom call, and I'm just trying to explain and present the program that we implement here. But in real life practicality, it would be more so of you guiding the students in a dialogue, facilitating dialogue with you being removed from it. And then to wrap it up in the end, you would then implement and start questioning some of the responses. But that's it from me. I'm going to turn this over to Miriam. If Miriam's good to go, let me see real fast. And if there's any questions, pop them in the chat. Our emails are at the end of the presentation. Thank you guys for being on the call. Thank you for listening to me during this part, and thank you for everybody being here. So let me see real fast. There we go.
Thanks, Ryan. Thanks, LZ. So I'm Miriam Rock. I teach 11th and 12th grade English at Friends Select. Just finishing up my 10th year of teaching, which I don't know how that happened, but I have been in the classroom for a decade. I think I started talking to LZ and Ryan, maybe LZ was like a year and a half ago.
I think it was like a solid 2 at this point.
It was 2 years ago. And just and I met Ryan last spring, I guess. And just every opportunity I get to work with them, I jump at. They are just 2 pretty incredible humans and pretty dedicated educators. So I just wanted to share a few slides about what I do in my classroom. Can everyone see the screen? Okay.
And that's where you're coming from today, right? Like we're seeing
Yes.
it, you're
This
in
is my
it.
classroom. It's in the dark, just first of all, because I like teaching in the dark and because I wanted to be the spotlight. But yeah, this is my classroom. I was talking to LZ about it before, and she was like, your classroom looks a little bit like a prison, which is true. And that's why I put art on the wall.
No, I was saying it doesn't.
Oh,
no,
it doesn't.
that it doesn't.
Oh, thank you.
No, so we had I'm gonna have to go into the Bex right now. We had another teacher present and she redid her classroom because she saw the inside of a prison. And her classroom, which is redone, non-prison, looks just like Miriam's. Like Miriam has like holiday lights in her classroom, like rugs, beanbag chairs. Like it's like no classroom I've ever been in. And it was just interesting to me that Tiff, this other teacher, shifted and the answer was the space that Miriam teaches in. So I can even see the rug behind you on the floor.
There it is.
So
Yeah.
some inspiration. No, your classroom does not look like a prison.
No, it's definitely one of the things. So I teach at Friends Select, which is a K through 12 private Quaker school. It's 3 blocks from City Hall in Philadelphia. And it's a fancy school, right? We have a pretty big endowment. We have, I think, about 40% of students are on financial aid. So the majority of students pay for the tuition. And we get all of these opportunities as a teacher that it feels it's wrong that private schools get these opportunities when public schools don't. And it means that what I get to do in this space is create a space that's a learning environment that's conducive to learning, right? That the kids can come in and their blood pressure can go down a little bit. And I have the budget to buy a rug that fits and the lights, et cetera. So about 650 students in the Friends Select school, K through 12, about 200 of them are in the upper school. 41% are students of color and 60%-ish are white students, which means that most classes are predominantly white. I think every so often I'll teach a class that's either a 50-50 split or it's a majority of students of color in the room. And it is really fascinating to see how different it feels in those different contexts. Because it's only 200 kids in the upper school, I teach the entire 11th grade. So the American literature curriculum, I fully set. It's in 3 sections of 16 students. We have these 3 weeks after winter break, but before the end of the quarter, these 3 weeks in January that I don't find particularly conducive for teaching a book because the kids have forgotten what happened before the quarter, before winter break, and they're not ready for what happens in second semester. And so I like to have those 3 weeks as a standalone unit. And for the last two years, I've been teaching a unit called Literature and Art of American Prisons. I actually developed this unit because I went to Eastern State Penitentiary several summers ago and was just so inspired by the work that they do and by how much the story of America is a story of incarceration, that it felt like in an American literature course, there was a moral imperative to teach this concept, this subject. The unit is intentionally interdisciplinary, so it draws on as many different things as I can think of. So contemporary art, historical art, poetry, written sort of by people experiencing incarceration, but putting those in conversation with poetry coming out of slavery, and sort of what are the parallels between like Paul Laurence Dunbar's We Wear the Mask. We talk about that poem a lot. Nonfiction essays, so things like MLK and Thoreau, but also Yuri Kochiyama's Then Came the War, which is about Japanese internment. We also watch a few documentary excerpts, we analyze data, we read some scholarly pieces. Elsie said she will put a link in the chat to the whole lesson plan. Please feel free. Anything in there that is useful, take it. I love teaching this curriculum to my students, and would love for it to be shared more broadly. We also, in fact, what Ryan just said, the Defining Justice tour. So I take my students on the Defining Justice tour. This year I got to do it with Ryan, which was amazing. And it's really magical to see the kids pointing out details from the art and saying how it makes them feel. And then I actually have them do a writing assignment afterwards where they write 2 paragraphs, 1 paragraph analyzing the image, which is practicing relevant English skills, and then 1 paragraph sort of more expansively talking about how they would define justice and sort of giving them the space to think about it in writing. All right, pause. So I wanted to spend today just talking about 3 different activities I do within this larger 3-week unit. So the first, and this is the very first day, I have each of them take out a device. And for some kids, it's a phone. For a lot of kids, it's a computer. And there is something called the Whole Pie 2024 put out by the American Prison Policy Initiative, something like that. Great. And this is just one of probably like 18 different slides with data on them. And I basically have the kids explore the data, and then I ask them what they notice. And if they notice something that they have questions about, if I can answer it, I answer it. If I can't, sometimes I Google it, sometimes I bring it up later. But it's just a really nice way to get the kids starting to make their way into the system and think about what story are these data telling us about who's incarcerated, where they're incarcerated, and why they're incarcerated. And one of the things a lot of them point out is the local jails, that over 400,000 people in the local jails are not convicted. But doesn't mean that we're locking up people in a country that says we're innocent until proven guilty. So we talk a lot about this data. That's one of the early days. I'm going to keep moving. I will also share these slides, so you're welcome to use these as you see fit. The second thing I wanted to share with you is I get really interested in sort of connections between contemporary conversations about prisons and older conversations about prisons. So America has been incarcerating people for a really long time. Last summer, I did a program through the National Endowment for Humanities at Heart Mountain Internment Camp, which was a Japanese internment camp in Wyoming. And so I learned a ton about Japanese internment during World War II. Japanese Americans were locked up in 10 internment camps. So basically any Japanese Americans from the West Coast, from California, Oregon, and Washington State, were in something called the exclusion zone. And they were locked up in internment camps in really desolate, horrible conditions. Often they had white soldiers, barbed wire. Japanese Americans in the East or in Hawaii were not locked up. And so there's a lot of art and literature about what that experience of being betrayed by your country when you had done nothing wrong was like. This is Roger Shibamura. He has several series. This series is called Minidoka on My Mind. Minidoka is the internment camp his family was incarcerated in. And what I have the students do is we analyze the images, and they talk about what they notice, and they sort of talk about like what are they seeing in these different images? What does it tell us about the experience of incarceration? What does it tell us about sort of how incarceration shapes what type of joy you have access to, what type of culture you have access to? We look at more images. Again, if this is something you're interested in and you want more resources about Japanese internment during World War II, I'm also happy to provide those. I do that. I do a day or so on Japanese internment during World War II in this unit, and then I do 2 or 3 days in another unit when we're talking about draft resistance and the Vietnam War, because there was a group of Japanese Americans who resisted the draft for World War II while they were in these camps and basically said, if you are denying my fundamental freedoms, I shouldn't have to be drafted to fight in a war. And so they went to jail because 63 of them went to jail because they resisted the draft. And when they went to court, they were asked if they pleaded guilty or not guilty. And they said they pleaded guilty because it was unconstitutional. And then they spent 3 years in prison after spending 3 years in an internment camp. And then the last thing I wanted to share with you is a documentary called Cue Ball, which we actually, I don't know if it's because it's actually a prison that puts out more, or if it's because it's California, it's closer to Hollywood. San Quentin prison in San Francisco, outside San Francisco, comes up a ton in this unit. We talk about it there's a sweat lodge in San Quentin prison. There's a lot of poetry that comes out of there. There's a lot of activism sort of during the Black Power movement. As Black Panther Party was in San Francisco, there was sort of a brother movement happening in San Quentin. So we do a lot on the history of San Quentin prison. And then I also have this documentary called Cue Ball, which is about the San Quentin basketball program. And this is sort of my filler piece. So I dedicate some time in class to watching Cue Ball. And then whenever a lesson ends early, we watch a little bit more. And the kids love it. And it's just it's a documentary that really effectively balances kind of showing the reality of prison to an extent. Like, I think one of the things Ryan and I have talked about is like, there are certain things you don't get to be shown unless you have experienced it, because we would get too angry about them. But I think it does a nice job of sort of showing what it is like from a certain lens to be incarcerated, but it also has joy, right? It's about these men finding community through a game, through physical exercise. And sort of, I think for me, I like the message about resilience that it showcases for my students. Yeah. So I wanted to show you, this is just the trailer. The whole documentary used to be available on YouTube. I was not able to find it when I most recently searched, but you can definitely stream it illegally. And hopefully can find it legal places. So I'm going to show you the documentary trailer, which is definitely legal. Let me know if you can't hear it.
I remember growing up and hearing about San Quentin. Maybe 6 to 8 months in, I witnessed my first murder here at San Quentin.
I was walking around ready to kill somebody for a long time before I finally killed somebody.
On three, warriors.
Warriors! I've never physically hurt a man in my life, and I get the same sentence as a murderer.
One day, the door is open for them. We believe that we have guys leaving prison today with better outcomes and more hope for the future.
Some of the toughest, meanest guys on the yard, you know, they'll tell you, I'm never going to a self-help group, but I'll play some basketball with you. Once a week, men from the outside, free men, come into prison to play basketball with convicts. It's amazing.
San Quentin Warriors, we are the other Warriors. Not the Golden State Warriors, but we like a little brother to them.
Basketball is all I've ever had. I'm not locked up, I'm not caged up, I'm not in prison. This is where I'm free.
We believe that we have guys who can come to prison and reclaim the man.
Being part of this team, it gives us a sense of purpose and togetherness.
That's what he do! Let's go!
Some of these guys missed their calling. They should have been on a Division I basketball team, but for whatever reason, they didn't make it.
Prison just stripped so much of my prime away from me.
Everything that happens is to drive us to God, not away from Him.
I really want to get out there and be somebody.
I need you to support me in between the lines.
If you just trust me.
Hey! Hey! Get down! Down!
So that's Cue Ball. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and just, I think there's a lot of things in the chat, but oh, thank you for sending that, LZ.
I did find cue ball on something called Tubi. It looks like it's real.
Perfect.
So the whole thing.
Ah, perfect. So if it's free on Tubi or purchasable on YouTube, Tubi is real. Great. It's a lovely, it's a nice documentary. Questions for me?
I mean, we always have questions for you, but other people should feel free to chime in. Could you talk about like some of the student reactions or even like the larger school community reactions to this unit?
Definitely. Such a great question. I think actually Ryan was there for this conversation where I was like, uh-oh, I need to rethink something. But I think we were on a tour with Ryan and Ryan was like, what do you guys think? Are we going to fix this problem? And my students were like, no. And there was this like, Ryan and I were both like, that's not the right spirit. But I think that one of the things that this unit does effectively is it shows them all of the ways in which the system has been built to deny people of their fundamental rights. And I think that's not necessarily the narrative that is out there in sort of the more general community. And so that feels to me like a good piece of education. I think I need to figure out, and I think it's maybe, I actually wrote a note here of like, I think the last day I need to really dedicate it to talking about hope and talking about it like sort of the work, the progress that has been made and making that framing really clear for the kids. Because I think I've gotten to the point where I can show them what the system is. And I think that can be really cathartic for kids who have been touched by the system, that if a family member of theirs or a friend of theirs is experiencing or has experienced mass incarceration, I think to see the system from a more intellectual and literary and impersonal space gives kids the space to process. But I think also we need to be really careful to not show so much of it that they feel defeated. Yeah, go ahead, Kimberly.
Hi. Well, coming from this is my 31st year teaching. So the years do go by fast and you don't realize it. But what you're doing is really awesome. I think what your question you raised about hope is really important. One of a lot of the research they're finding is that with Generation Z, they've literally lost the sense of hope and kind of lost a sense of purpose. And there's been a lot of focus that needs to be kind of part of engagement with students. So I think you're right on the money with that. And have you had tried having your kids write like a found poem using the primary sources?
Can you tell me more about what a found poem is?
A found poem is when the students write a poem, but all the words come from the primary source. And they use poetic devices plus like, font colors, size, spacing to then write a narrative. I had my students do it for the first time this year with Letter from Birmingham Jail, my AP Gov kids. And after we worked with it, I gave it as an extra credit option. And I said, I want your focus to be which argument from Letter from Birmingham Jail you thought was the most important. And almost every one of my AP kids did it. And they turned out amazing. And one of the students emailed me and was like, Ms. Barban, I really like that you had us do this. You should do it again next year. So, and I used to do a lot more things like that when I taught history, but not as much with Gov. But I was just thinking, since you work with Letter from Birmingham and you work with Thoreau, and then you look at these sources, that would also could be like a cool literary historical tool.
That's a really great idea. Yeah, I haven't done that before, but I love that because I think one of the things we talk about when we talk about Thoreau and Letter from Birmingham Jail is like civil disobedience. And I sort of ask the kids, I'm like, what are you willing to get arrested for? What is there something you would be willing to go to jail for? And then they like will turn it back on me and ask me the same thing. But I think that that's a lovely, I love the idea of sort of taking specific words from the primary source and bringing it to life. We sometimes do something called a text explosion, which if we're reading like a poem or like a passage, I'll have every kid pick a sentence, a phrase, and a word, and we go around and everyone reads their sentence, then their phrase, then the word. And so you start to get kind of like a collective found poem of what's the language that's sticking out to them. But I like that idea a lot. Thank you.
You're welcome. And if you want to see what my EP kids did, LZ and Ryan have my email, and I'll gladly share it with you.
I'd love that. Yeah. Yeah, it is. I think the other thing that comes out of this unit, and this is, I think, partially specific to my school, that so Friend Select is in the city of Philadelphia, and we have a head of school who really wants the school to reflect the city of Philadelphia and comes up against the fact that it's a private school. And so he has been working really hard to bring in more students from more neighborhoods in Philly. And those students will often come to this school. And so students who are coming from farther into North Philly, farther into West Philly, farther into South Philly, will come to the school and will feel a real culture shock. And I think will be really frustrated sort of to not have their stories being represented. And so for a couple kids in particular this year, one of the things that we did, we actually had LZ and Ryan come and do a panel with a couple other Eastern State people. And then they have, oh my God, lead fellows?
Yeah, I'll drop a link.
Okay, good. They have these lead fellows who are people going through reintegration who work with Eastern State, and they would be much better to explain it than I. But they work with Eastern State to develop relevant skills and to transition out more successfully. And the lead fellows talk to my students, and the questions my students asked, they have never asked a teacher. Like, they would never consider asking me, but they were questions like, how do you use faith to get through hard times? Like, my brother doesn't want to say he loves me after he's been released. Can you tell me how to understand that? And sort of this opportunity to connect with people who have this lived experience. I think when I think about what are the most lasting moments from this curriculum, especially for the students who often feel like outsiders at my school, for them to be able to connect to Ryan and to the lead fellows and to learn and feel in community in that way, I think was just incredibly powerful.
And we're going to level up and do a reentry simulation at your school.
Yes, we are.
Just to play off that, what you said, it reminds me of what happened with a lot of Holocaust survivors. Viktor Frankl wrote a book about what it was like for Holocaust survivors to try to transition back into life, and the question of those who lost hope and the ability to express their love. And so yeah, that's actually really powerful connection. I can't think of the name of the book right now, but it's really powerful. And since you're doing stuff with the Japanese American internment, if you wanted to go in that direction, it's yeah. I see Ryan's blowing it up. He knows the book I'm talking about.
Yeah.
I just can't think of the title right now.
But
it's really powerful, and he talks a lot about that. And my grandparents were Holocaust survivors. So my grandmother, she didn't talk about her experiences at all with anyone until I was old enough to ask. And then she told me about what it was like to be in Buchenwald and all of that. And my mom and my aunt and uncle never knew anything. They just knew she had survived. But then when I started telling them the stories, then they began to understand my grandmother and see her in a very different light. They didn't understand the whole time. And they were just like, why didn't she ever share? And I was like, well, this is because it's hard for them to share from what they've experienced and what they shut down, and how you have to compartmentalize and to survive, and, and the parallels. So used to having those kids ask those stories, I don't know, it just reminds me of the connection to that as well.
That's amazing. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, no, it's
Yeah.
especially when I talk about Japanese internment with the kids, like one of the things when I learned out in Wyoming, one of the points they made was that like our Japanese internment camps were concentration camps, right?
Yep.
What we had in Germany, those were death camps. They were concentration camps with a purpose of killing people, mostly Jews, but also other people. But the internment camps are concentration camps. The goal was
Yep.
to concentrate the Japanese population so that white Americans were safe, right?
Yep.
And that, then you compare that to like Michelle Alexander and sort of the new Jim Crow and the
Yep.
how many Black men are locked up. Like the parallels are really eerie.
And especially because the Supreme Court had ruled originally that it was constitutional. So you can't even rely on the court and the Supreme Court to be the arbitrator of justice, because look, they already had the precedent where they ruled wrong with that.
Right.
I was gonna put this in the chat, but I just wanna like, if like you can go to LA and go to the Japanese American National Museum and you can meet people who were actually incarcerated during World War II. And they lead programs and they like will talk to you about their lived experience. So, you know, you can't deny somebody's lived experience. And I think that like where we find moments of like common humanity is how we like can connect into each other, even when like we feel really isolated or feel really different. And I think that like all of these lived experiences that we're sharing they're all connected and they're all traumatic. And that's why people may not feel safe talking about it or asking about it, or like might only feel safe in a specific scenario, like being with other people that look like them or have the same lived experience as them.
There's actually a lot of Japanese
Yeah.
American internment camp survivors in New Jersey. So
Oh,
a lot of
wow.
them, after they got out of the camp, they resettled. When I first started teaching, it was like the anniversary of the internment, and the Smithsonian had a traveling exhibit, and they brought some of the survivors that were now living in New Jersey. They ended up working in like a cannery factory for like fish or something, and brought them to me. And it turns out there's like whole pockets of parts of New Jersey where they had settled. I can't recall like the specific towns, but there is, yeah, so there might still actually be one to see if you can even bring in a Japanese American internment camp survivor that's like in the area. I know that they're based in New Jersey.
You did that, right, Miriam, with Sam?
Yeah. Sam Mahara, he lives in California. I'll put his name in the chat. He was interned at Heart Mountain. That's how I got connected with him. But he travels the country and loves talking to school groups. So he was out talking to Penn. I ended up bringing him to Friend Select, and then he actually also went to Eastern State. He is just a spectacular person to talk to.
Yeah, if you need his contact info, let me know. Anybody on the call.
That would be awesome to send out, Elsie.
Yeah, Sam is epic. What a kind person. So that brings us to the end of our time together. I really want to thank everybody for being on this call. Again, this is our last Teachback in this series. We've really enjoyed doing this, meeting all of you, bringing in all of these incredible experts. Thank you, Miriam, for the work that you do. Thank you, everybody on this call, for the work that you do. We will be doing our Teacher Institute again in August. We should have the application coming out soon, the details soon. And then you'll get an email tomorrow with the recording of this, any of the materials that we shared, and then a survey as well about the program. And if you are in Pennsylvania and want to apply for Act 48 credit, you can do that in the survey as well. So thanks, everybody. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. We appreciate you.
Thanks, guys. This was awesome.